We might get the impression from this gospel reading from the 13th chapter of Mark that Jesus is telling us what the end of the world will be like. I mean, after all, we have these cosmic catastrophes of the stars falling from the sky and the sun and the moon darkening. It seems to be so very frightening. And yet, there is that line that we see towards the end of this passage today in which Jesus says this generation will not pass away before these things happen. And so is an opportunity for us to think not so much about the end of the world in terms of its physical collapse of the universe, but rather how many ways in our lives we experience the familiar coming to an end, the world as we know it changing so drastically, the distress that we feel in those moments in which uncertainty invades our lives. I think of those people who are undergoing surgeries and entering into a risky surgery and procedure, or those who are beginning treatments for cancer. Their whole world is coming to a change, not necessarily an end, but there is a change. Or I think also of those people who suffer the great heartache of divorce, in which the familiar is passing away. All of their investments in a relationship seem now to become crashing down. And then, of course, the angst and anxiety that the person, the worker who feels when they lose their job, knowing that their life is going to dramatically change because the familiar that they counted on before now will be changed dramatically. And so it's important, I think, for us to realize that Jesus is also talking about that kind of distress in our lives. But notice right away that as soon as that distress of the sight of things collapsing around us occurs, it is Jesus who enters into the scene. It's a reminder that in these darkest moments of our life is precisely where God does his greatest work, and reminds us that our lives are not over in those moments in which we feel distress, that he comes to us in those moments and bids us to keep going, to move ahead, to realize that there is something more to our lives than perhaps we otherwise counted on. How often in life, in those change moments, those moments in which we were at a crossroads and did not know the way, the Lord was with us in a way that allows us to take up a new direction in our lives. And he gives us that image of the fig tree that is brown and crusted over in the winter. And all of a sudden, there is a sprout of the green leaf, the bud that comes forth. Maybe we have experienced that as well, where our lives were so very dry and seemed to be at an end. And all of a sudden, God is there with a new grace in our lives to give us another direction. That is what we are to celebrate today in Thanksgiving. How time and again God has been with us in those very dark moments in which we felt distress and anxiety. To remember that the Lord is present most in those moments, and we should begin to look for the green that's there. I often tell people when they say to me that something that occurred in the world or in their lives seems to be so very much a catastrophe and a cataclysm, that they should not overplay it too much, because at the heart of our faith, we believe that the worst thing in the world that can happen has already happened. God sent his Son into our world, and we nailed him to a tree. And yet there was still new life. He came back from the dead for us. That is so important as we look at the moments of distress, the worry, anxiety in our lives, to see them not so much as an end, but as a new beginning, as an opportunity in which the Lord is going to do something new. You know, we say in that prayer after the Our Father, by the help of your mercy, may we be kept free from sin and safe from all distress as we await the blessed hope and the coming of our Savior Jesus Christ. Let's give some thought to what those words mean as we hear them today said in the Eucharist, that the Lord is the one who comes into our life to give us new hope, to save us in moments of sin, and delivers us from stress, the distress that we feel, realizing that those end-of-the-world moments in our lives surely are not the end, for God has always so much more in store for each one of us.